Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. The Architecture of Experience, Chapter 5, Invisible Distances, Proxemics and Spatial Relationships. In the previous chapter, we examined how ergonomic systems often rely on the idea of an average human, a statistical abstraction that simplifies bodily diversity into standardized dimensions. We explored how these standards shape architecture in ways that appear neutral while quietly privileging certain bodies, behaviors, and cultural assumptions over others. Yet once we move beyond the idea of a single standard body, another question emerges. Architecture is rarely experienced alone. Space is shaped not only by the relationship between the body and the environment, but also by the relationship between bodies themselves. In this chapter, we will examine the invisible spatial distances that organize everyday interaction and how these subtle dynamics influence behavior, perception, and social experience. When discussing ergonomics, design often focuses on measurable physical conditions such as reach, circulation, posture, or accessibility. However, human experience within space is shaped not only by physical capability, but also by social proximity. People continuously negotiate invisible territories around themselves, adjusting distance according to context, emotion, familiarity, and culture. These spatial negotiations are so deeply embedded within everyday life that they often go unnoticed, yet they fundamentally influence how environments are perceived and used. This phenomenon is commonly described through the concept of proxemics, introduced by anthropologist Edward T. Hall to explain how humans organize personal space and social distance. Hall argued that spatial relationships are not random but structured through culturally conditioned behavioral patterns. Distances communicate intimacy, authority, comfort, tension, and exclusion without requiring words. A step forward can signal confidence or aggression. A slight retreat can indicate discomfort or respect. Space, in this sense, functions as a social language long before it becomes verbal communication. What makes proxemics particularly significant for architecture is that these invisible distances are constantly shaped by design. The arrangement of furniture, the width of circulation paths, the scale of rooms, and the positioning of thresholds all influence how bodies relate to one another. A narrow corridor forces proximity and alters behavioral patterns. A large open lobby changes social awareness and personal orientation. A tightly packed cafe produces different interactions from a spacious restaurant, even if the activities taking place remain technically the same. Architecture, therefore, does not simply contain social interaction, it actively structures it. At the same time, these relationships are highly sensitive to cultural context. Spatial distances considered comfortable within one society may feel inappropriate within another. Some cultures tolerate closer bodily proximity during conversation, while others maintain greater interpersonal distance. Similarly, ideas surrounding privacy, publicness, and personal territory vary significantly across regions and traditions. What appears welcoming in one context may feel invasive in another. This means that proxemics cannot be reduced to universal formulas any more than the body itself can. The importance of this becomes increasingly visible in globalized architectural practice. Buildings are often designed according to international standards while being inhabited by culturally diverse populations whose expectations regarding space may differ considerably. A workplace organized around open-plan interaction may encourage collaboration for some users while producing anxiety or discomfort for others. Likewise, domestic layouts that assume certain patterns of privacy or family interaction may conflict with cultural habits elsewhere. Architecture, therefore, operates not only at the level of physical function, but also at the level of social behavior and psychological comfort. These invisible spatial negotiations also reveal that comfort is not purely physiological. Traditional ergonomic discussions frequently focus on measurable bodily conditions such as posture, lighting, temperature, and circulation efficiency. While these factors remain essential, social comfort can be equally important. A technically functional environment may still feel stressful if spatial relationships generate constant tension or overstimulation. Crowding, excessive openness, lack of personal territory, or forced visibility can all produce discomfort even when ergonomic standards are technically satisfied. This is particularly evident in contemporary urban environments where density often compresses interpersonal distance beyond comfortable levels. Public transport, commercial centers, and large-scale workplaces continually force bodies into proximity, creating environments in which social negotiation is constant. In such conditions, people develop behavioral strategies to manage discomfort. They avoid eye contact, minimize movement, use headphones as psychological barriers, or retreat into digital devices to create temporary personal boundaries in crowded spaces. These behaviors demonstrate that personal territory is not purely physical, but also psychological. Architecture can either intensify or ease these tensions. Spatial design influences whether proximity feels oppressive or manageable, whether interaction feels forced or voluntary. Small adjustments in layout, materiality, visibility, and circulation can significantly affect how people experience social distance. A seating arrangement that subtly allows personal choice may create comfort even within limited space, while poorly considered layouts can generate tension despite generous dimensions. This reveals that spatial relationships are not simply quantitative matters of distance but qualitative conditions of perception. The rise of digital culture has further complicated these relationships. Contemporary life increasingly blurs distinctions between public and private space, physical presence, and mediated interaction. Cafes become workplaces, homes become studios, and digital communication alters how bodies occupy shared environments. People may physically share space while remaining psychologically elsewhere through screens and devices. As a result, architecture now operates in a hybrid condition in which bodily proximity no longer guarantees social engagement. At the same time, recent global events, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, have dramatically exposed how sensitive spatial relationships truly are. Distances that once felt normal suddenly became sources of anxiety. Terms such as social distancing entered everyday language, transforming proxemics from an invisible behavioral condition into an explicit spatial concern. Architecture, urban design, and interior layouts were rapidly reconsidered through the lens of interpersonal distance. Although many temporary measures have faded, the pandemic revealed how quickly spatial norms can shift when bodies become associated with vulnerability and risk. Importantly, proxemics also challenges the assumption that architecture is experienced primarily through vision. Social distance is often sensed before it is consciously analyzed. Bodies respond instinctively to overcrowding, exposure, enclosure, and territorial intrusion. These reactions occur emotionally and physically long before they become intellectual interpretations. In this sense, architecture operates not only as a visual composition but as a behavioral atmosphere. The organization of space quietly shapes emotional states and patterns of interaction through invisible spatial cues. This understanding shifts architecture away from the idea of static form and towards relational space. A room is no longer simply an enclosure defined by dimensions and materials, but a dynamic field of negotiation between bodies. Space becomes meaningful through interaction, not merely occupation. The success of architecture, therefore, cannot be measured solely through appearance or technical performance, but through its ability to support healthy and adaptable social relationships. In many ways, proxemics reveals that architecture is always political, albeit subtly. Spatial arrangements determine who feels welcome, who feels excluded, who controls visibility, and who controls territory. These decisions may appear minor, yet they profoundly influence everyday behavior. A waiting room, classroom, office, or public square all distribute social power through spatial organization. Distance itself becomes a design tool that can either encourage connection or reinforce separation. In this chapter, we have explored how invisible distances shape human experience within space, and how architecture quietly structures relationships between bodies through proximity, territory, and movement. We have seen that social comfort cannot be separated from physical comfort, and that spatial experience is always conditioned by cultural and behavioral context. More importantly, we have begun to understand that architecture does not simply organize objects and dimensions, but also the invisible relationships that emerge between people within space. In the next chapter, we will move from invisible distances to movement itself. We will examine how bodies navigate architecture dynamically over time and how movement transforms space from a static arrangement into an unfolding experience. The discussion will shift from proximity to motion, from territory to rhythm. Because once architecture begins to organize relationships among bodies, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does space change when bodies move through it? This concludes Chapter 5 of the Architecture of Experience, Invisible Distances, Proxemics, and Spatial Relationships. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.